All right, good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us in this session where we are going to be closing a day and a half of intense work around the climate transitions. So let me start with Monday, and let me start with Charlotte, because Monday was an important day in this house. We launched the Institute for Environmental Transformation, one of the very three big legs on which Sciences Po will rest from now on, which is our commitment to putting the fight against climate change and more broadly environmental sustainability at the heart of our institution, our commitment to build knowledge, to build solutions, to build leadership in partnership with others. So that was Monday. Today is Wednesday, so we've been working Tuesday and Wednesday to deploy the spirit of this institute in a partnership we called CARE, a partnership between Sciences Po and three Canadian universities, Toronto, Guelph, and UBC, to build the next generation of environmentally conscious global leaders and citizens with cross-cultural learning and experiences. This is a bit what we have in mind. This is an initiative that is financed by the DRG Foundation. Thank you, Oliver, for being with us through this day and a half. And the idea was to use 2022-23 to build a longer-term initiative around 5 years that would look at this climate leadership space. Now, a final decision will be made about the next 5 years soon, but we wanted to take a stock of this year's work and do that around the four big themes that have been the day and a half working together. First one about climate change and development. Second one about urban climate transition. Third one around energy and the energy transitions. And the fourth one around community-based local solutions. So this is precisely what we will do this evening. And in order to do that, let me start by introducing the panel from right to left. Let me start with Charlotte Halpern, who is the director of the Institute for Environmental Transformation. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for joining us tonight. Next to her, Milind Kandilikar, professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia. Thank you so much. To my left, Diana Lewis, assistant professor, University of Guelph, Canada, research chair for Indigenous Environmental Health Governance. And to her left, Mark Ringle, who's the chairholder of the European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transitions here at Sciences Po. So we're going to start by asking each one of them to give us some snippets about the roundtables they led during this last day and a half. But before we do that, we wanted to start with a poem. We wanted to start with Madhur Anand. She's professor at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. And we're going to start with a poem because we need inspiration to build this leadership. And this is what she will do right now. So, Madhur,
it's a big ask.
Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, hi everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to come here and to speak about my ecological work, scientific work, but also now my other side, which is that I am also an artist. I'm a poet. And inevitably, the two areas overlap on both sides because creativity, inspiration, exist in all those realms. So I'm going to read you one poem from my first book of poetry, which is entitled A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes. And I'm going to just explain it a little bit. And a lot of people ask this question, so I'll very quickly tell you that I became a scientist first. I had no idea that I was an artist until the final year of writing up my PhD thesis. So you have time, all of you, to pursue many, many ways of knowing towards understanding our complex challenges that we're going to be going through as humans over the next several years together. Yeah, I'll tell you the story maybe another time, but basically it came out of nowhere that one day I was sitting at my desk doing my PhD thesis, and I had a scientist's block. You know how you get writer's block? Well, I got scientist's block, and I couldn't continue, and I walked over to the window, I looked outside, I came back to my desk, and I wrote my first poem. I had never read poetry, written poetry, and it started like that. But like anything else in life worth doing, it took many years and work and effort to try to improve, and then my first book was published in 2015. I write about many different topics because the thing about art and poetry and writing that's a little bit different from the tradition of science, not science itself, but the tradition of doing science, is that you can't really separate all of the different ideas and parts of you and of the world. They all enter into the art. Which is something that we as scientists are not very good at doing, frankly, and our tradition of the scientific method doesn't really allow the interdisciplinarity and the humanity to show. So maybe that's why I became an artist as well, not sure, but it happened. And one of the things I found myself doing for this book was looking at some of my own scientific articles that I had written with my collaborators and students and starting to looking at them from a 90-degree angle, which I don't know if you can imagine what that means. I just didn't, but my only way of imagining what that meant was via art, via poetry. So I looked at those narratives of science, which as you know are quite conventional, abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion. And I thought, I want to intervene in the most radical way I can with what's there on the page. So I wrote found poems from those scientific articles. I looked at the text and I picked out words. I made a list of words that occurred in those scientific articles, and I rearranged them to make poems. And I'm fairly sure I'm the first person to have ever done that from their own scientific articles. So I'm going to read you one of those. And I think very aptly it ends with a question, because I think that from our discussions, it's clear that we don't quite have the answers. We're going to hear lots of wonderful ideas here, but we don't have all the answers. So the poem is entitled Forward, Backward Procedure. Because we simply do not have enough information a priori. Because no sequence is emitted. No conservative lower bound. Because the annual cycling might represent a recurring disturbance. Because well-known abilities can be masked. We have no framework for dealing with the shortcomings, the curve as it approaches zero. There are 4 problems that must be solved: drought, power, psychology, and light. How many states should the final model have? And that's found from an article by Tucker and Anand on the use of stationary versus hidden Markov models to detect simple versus complex ecological dynamics, published in the journal Ecological Modeling. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Madhur. This was a very nice way to start this conversation. Let me now pass the floor to Charlotte. Charlotte, you were at the roundtable on urban climate transition. So what are the snippets that we should remember from this roundtable? So what did we learn?
Well, first, we learned one of the questions that we started with at this roundtable. And first, maybe I want to name the participants and the speakers, sure, because I'm not sure everyone's, have this in mind. I think it's important. So we had 4 speakers in this roundtable. We had Gabriel Edelman, who is from University of Toronto, from the Monk School, and he provided his perspective on how cities can make a difference by building at the metropolitan level and building a voice at that particular level. Then we had a presentation from 2 PSIA students. So one of them is in the room. So we had Anouk Constantin and Vinicius Paul, who are both students who are leading on an initiative which is called Pour le Brésil, in which they develop some initiatives to train and to promote youth and female leaders in cities in the Amazon region, in order to bring a different perspective on cities in that region and to focus more specifically on the role of cities in an area which is often represented through its nature but not necessarily through its urban dimension. And myself, through a work that I've been doing with a colleague of mine, Alvaro Artigas, in which we worked on local climate plans in Europe and in Southeast Asia, in which we looked at how cities, develop beautiful plans, but do not necessarily impact on their policy priorities and deliver on those objectives. So, what was the aim, of bringing this set of people together to discuss their work? Well, I think we had two main objectives. The first objective was to put cities back into the center perspective, not to just see them as a playground for economic actors, national governments, international organizations, development banks, to come and develop some initiatives, develop some experiments, develop some best practice, to do this for 2-3 years and then to leave again without asking themselves, how to scale up and how to develop these initiatives into something more substantial in terms of policy and governance. So first point was to really look at them in terms of what is happening at city level. And second, to understand a little bit better what cities are doing. So as a result of this, there were two main, I would say, takeaways. The first one was part of Gabriel's work, I think, Gabriel Edelman, where he really looked at what cities do and looked into 3 different directions, saying, well, in terms of climate and climate transition, cities do 3 different things. First, they declare an emergency. They have symbolic action. They sue their state, the national state, for inaction. And we know in Europe, with Madrid, with Paris, with Brussels, this is something they did. They sued the European Commission, they sued their national states to highlight the fact that they were just not doing their job. So to declare an emergency and to have symbolic action. They also try to lead by example. By developing some front-running, some pioneer initiatives, some policies that are going to lead the way and highlight, that they could be leaders and front-runners in this discussion at the global level in terms of what is being achieved on climate dimension. And they also have some aspirational initiatives which have to do with setting markets, making plans, trying to put some targets and objectives on the table to guide their ways and to provide, sort of long-term targets that they could really follow and develop on. And I think Gabe was very convincing in going through those different types of policies, but also highlighting the fact that cities on their own, especially in countries and contexts where they do not have formal representation, need to scale up at the metropolitan level in order to organize themselves, in order to develop the services, in order to develop the networks, in order to develop the adaptation strategies that are going to make a difference in climate action. So that's the first thing, to think about cities, but more at a metropolitan level. And I sort of got from the discussion that followed And some of the people and students who ask questions, are in the room, so they might want to follow up with this. But it was a very Canadian discussion going on the role of cities in this particular context, and comparing Vancouver with Toronto. They've even brought Quebec and Montreal in, so there was a big discussion on how to make this debate happen in Canada. And then we had a second perspective, a second focus, which came from the two other presentations, which really focused on how to build capacity, how to empower youth, female leaders, city leaders, in order to become actors in climate transitions, and to not just be the recipient of those proposals, but also to proactively set the agenda, to become actively involved in setting the priorities, in setting what should be the priority as part of a climate adaptation agenda. Should it be about the just transition? Should it be about addressing inequalities? Should it be about linking together with rural areas? I think this was one of the questions that was raised yesterday. What should this climate transition agenda about? And what are the main goals? And in order to do that, they first need to build capacity, to build the ability to understand, to know, to have the data, but also to think about the political strategies, about the political ability, about what they want to reach as a society, as a community in a few years' time. So those were the two main takeaways. I hope I haven't been too long. I wasn't sure about format, but I think this would be the two main points.
Great, thank you so much. So cities first. Second, Milind, you were at the roundtable on climate change and development. So what did we learn there?
Climate change and development, it's the whole thing, right? That's what this problem is about. And so kind of synthesizing the session as I'm thinking through is just as challenging as the problem itself. So let me take a crack at, so there were three of us. Myself, you can call me a techno-optimist engineer for the purposes of this meeting. We had Dr. Madhur Anand, who you just heard. She's an ecologist, but with a humanist half. She talked as well on the question of sustainability. And we had Pierre Chabonnier, who is, I might be characterizing him the best I can, is a philosopher with Marxist leanings. I don't know if that's correct. And so the three of us were on the table, and we were struggling with this elephant called development. And one of us was holding the tail, another one was rubbing the belly, and the third one was, feeling the trunk. So it was an interesting conversation. Let me just try and synthesize, if I can, a few of the themes that co-occurred, let's say. The first theme that co-occurred was in each of us presentations, in some way, the idea of a human. Right? So when Madhur talked about her work on sort of models, most models tend to look at the effect of environmental variables on people, right? But then how people endogenously change in response to those forcings, sorry to use a technical term there, and how that then changes the system is really poorly characterized, right? And now, as we are entering into this really unprecedented zone, we really need to understand how, you're all young people here, and you are, not all of you, but most of you, you are going to change the world, and it's in some ways in your hands to make that shift, right? You can call, you can say, okay, boomer, right? That's fine. Okay, so that's one finding that we reach, which is basically how we think of people and how people are going to respond and how we set up the institutions to help them make choices that are correct is going to determine the future. And I don't think we have fully thought through how to do it. Now, some of this will be muddling through. There will be a lot of learning by doing, but that's a central challenge. It's a challenge of development. It's also a challenge for industrialized countries. It's everybody's challenge. The second theme that emerged, at least from my perspective, is how does one think of this transition? Right? Transition to what? Are we simply going to replace the set of incumbent technologies and ways of doing things with those that have a lower carbon footprint? Is that the ambition? That sounds like a limited ambition. Do we want to actually make something more transformative? How do you do that, given that we have a very short period of time and the speed at which we can change people and societies is much longer? So I think that was the second theme, which is, on the one hand, we want to imagine a world in which is more just, which is more equitable, which is more sustainable and environmentally friendly. We have vast differences across populations in terms of their needs and capacities to adapt. And we also then want to move all of these people into someplace better. And that is the sort of central challenge, not simply fixing the carbon piece. So those were, in my view, the two big themes that emerged out of that discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Diana. You were on the group, on the roundtable relating to community-based local solutions. So from the local to the local, or from the local to the super local. What did we learn in this roundtable?
Thank you. I'm going to start by thanking you for inviting me and thanking you for coming in my language. Walaliak dan Delibejidayak, Walaliak dan Betgimiak, Nindaluisi Diana Lewis, Delewi Sebeganegadi Gakmigmagi. So thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. My community is Sebeganegadi First Nation. I'm Mi'kmaq from the Atlantic provinces in Canada. And that's how we would traditionally start our conversations. So I was on a roundtable with Sebastian Trayer, who is the Executive Director of the Institute of Sustainable Development and Science Po-based think tank on sustainable transformation, working on international negotiations on sustainability policy, and a postdoc here at Sciences Po, Pia Bailo, who works on mining processes in the Arctic and Greenland specifically, and looking at the impacts of the European Green Deal on Greenlandic mining. And she brought her perceptions of local and Indigenous voices from the mining impacts in Greenland. And then I presented how to look at Indigenous knowledge and to understand when Indigenous communities are presenting their perspectives, how to interpret that along with Western knowledge so that you get a full perspective on local impacts of climate change or sustainability or extractive industry, whatever it might be. The objectives of this group was to bring the perspective of local and Indigenous voice to this discussion. And as we were summarizing, I started to think about something we didn't address in our roundtable that I'll take an opportunity to address to this audience, because as young people, you're just starting your careers, and this could be really informative for you if you go forward in a field where you have to take into consideration local community voice. And so Pia had mentioned that in Greenland, sometimes despite Indigenous local community engagement, companies were not adequately reflecting that voice back in some of the policy changes, some of the actions they were pursuing, and other times were leaving Greenland without the communities being informed. And it got me to think about this protection we have in Canada for Indigenous knowledge. So when Indigenous communities contribute their perspective, we have what's called OCAP principles that stand for ownership, control, access, and possession, so that if we share our knowledge, we have protections on companies extracting that knowledge and walking away with it. So any knowledge we share, we retain ownership. and possession so that it never gets into anybody else's hands and we share it through our own voice. So know that there are principles that can be adapted internationally to protect local and indigenous knowledge. And my presentation was demonstrating how to integrate indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, which Western scientists aren't so great at being able to do. And then Sebastian was saying that the global discussion is in the very early stages of incorporating, especially indigenous voice, and there's a lot of maturing that has to happen before they do that well.
Thank you. I wish I could thank you in your language, so maybe for the next session you will tell me how to do that, but it would be a nice way to reciprocate. Thank you, Diana. Mark, you were in the roundtable on energy transitions, so what did we learn there?
Quite a bit. We had a fantastic panel, actually, in terms of composition. We had Giacomo Ciani from taking the European perspective. We had Elena Morrison from the Canadian perspective, getting up at 7:30 to make it via Zoom. And we were extremely happy to have Divya Reddy from the International Energy Agency, the country study division. Should explain that a bit. She kicked us off on Canada, and actually the country study division, if you want to work there, is probably the coolest place in the IEA. That's the people moving around with government officials from other member countries of the IEA, going into a country, staying there for a week, and meeting every energy professional, being around, asking every stupid question that you could ask. So after that week, you know the country, you know the energy system, you know what's working and what's not. And Divya kicked us actually into that by presenting on the Canadian energy situation and climate situation. The interesting thing and the interesting takeaway, and probably here I'm mirroring what many of my predecessors actually mentioned, is that actually Canada and the EU is sort of similar but different, and that is just the very interest of it. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the details, I mean, the things that these two constituencies have in common: decarbonization objectives by mid of the century, an ongoing energy transition, loads of policy instruments which are very similar: European emission trading scheme, emission trading in several Canadian provinces, carbon taxation. So there's a lot of common ground at the beginning. Next, though, when you look at the differences in terms of setting up, and that now led to the theme of energy security, the two are very different animals. I mean, the EU, what they themselves labeled as Gulliver in chains, so, you know, a giant consuming energy, but bound by the chains of, you know, being energy dependent on neighbors, mm-hmm. Russia, for a good time. And on the other side, Canada being net exporter of clean energy, but also fossil fuels. So pretty much when you look at these puzzle pieces, you see that you've got quite a lot of overlaps where you can, I mean, work on similarities, but quite a lot of complementarities actually to engage in, well, probably would be labeled economic cooperation, technological cooperation. So that'd be oil, that'd be liquefied natural gas, to speak about the hydrocarbons, but also clean hydrogen, green, clean, going into that debate. Now that sounds very economic, it sounds very technological, so just like research policy cooperation, let's go for that. But that's, here again also, well, the first part of it. The second part is that it's policy-wise pretty much of the same instruments, strategies, but still a lot of difference in that it actually sort of cries out for policy comparison, for seeing, you know, how can we compare? Can we learn something from the emission trading scheme that British Columbia has in place to take home for us? Can the Canadian side, for example, learn from the support for the just transition which is taking place in the coal regions? Because that was a topic which we developed because nobody actually claimed that the energy transition, the climate transition would be an easy one, would come at zero cost. So there are hardships to it, there are structural changes, workplaces, people being affected. How do you manage that? So there's a whole range of actually policy management behind it to compare policies to see what is around actually to smoothen up this transformation. So pretty much what Sciences Po and many of our students would actually look into in terms of how to develop good policies to make this transition happening. So cutting a very long story short and not taking too long here, I think the idea at the end when we had to stop was really that we said there was an interesting kickoff, but it was just the start of the debate and many have to follow. I think to wrap up, that's the energy side of it.
Great, thank you very much. Let me ask you, where are the good options right now to address the climate transitions? Where would you say is?
Yeah.
Where are they?
Well, if I had the answer, I guess it'd be there. But I think something that came out from the panel yesterday, was very interesting, is that we started with cities, but we ended up in a discussion about multi-level governance. We said, all right, this is the environment in which we operate. So we could say, it's a problem, it's a source of barrier, it's going to be a hindrance, but this is what it is. So when I'm thinking about good options, and your questions, Arantxa, I think part of the answer is to take this seriously and to think in terms of either thinking about good options at a scale that would allow to build sufficient capacity and ability to put some topics out there, to develop some networks, to develop some solutions in terms of funding, in terms of debating, in terms of finding the right way, to bring communities in, but also to think about this at city level. And I think part of what we developed in this session was really to focus on the metropolitan level. This is really what came out very strongly, is that we need to think beyond the city's border and the metropolitan level, even in some areas that are not so densely populated, could be a good opportunity to think about coordination, to sort of have a middle scale at which we could think about those options. And we also need to acknowledge the fact that this is not something that is currently possible across member states in the EU and in a number of countries in the world. And this is something that came out also from the presentation by Gabe, from Gabe, or in Brazil, we would have cities which are quite strong in the constitutionally, but still we also have the federal states. And then if we want to think about federal level, we need to, at the metropolitan level, we need to think about something different. So what does it mean, to build this scale? So this is one of the good options, to scale up at the metropolitan level as one of the good options that we need to think about. Apart from this particular institutional option that we need to think about, there was a second option that came in, which was very much about discussion in terms of how do we think about bringing rural areas back in the picture. And I think there were a few questions around this, but I guess in the presentation, the idea was to say that cities would not be able to lead on this particular fight on their own. They would need to reach out to their national governments. They would need to get the support from them. And of course, we're looking at very, very different contexts. We're talking about some countries in which you can't expect much from your national governments when it comes from climate transition. I think there were some discussions about, the US under Trump government. There were some discussions about Bolsonaro's policies in Brazil. We can talk about some specific cases in Europe. So we definitely need to think about whether or not the national government is that of an option. But I guess beyond the politics and the political cycle, when we think about good options, it is more or less in terms of cooperating between those different levels and having national governments take their responsibility in thinking about good options for rural areas. We can't put the burden and the blame back on cities for trying, to reduce the role of the car in very, very densely populated urban centers where there is a lot of pollution, where there is a lot of cars and vehicles and traffic and needs and so on. We also need national governments, maybe the EU, for example, to also think about what could be an interesting, sustainable mobility transition for rural areas. And so we need to think about this more in cooperation. So this was the second one. So I guess good options, one is institutional, one is political. And it is another way to say that good options are not just technical, and they're not just about community-led or individual-led, about changing behaviors. They also need to be about capacity building from an institutional and a political point of view.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Diana. What would be a good option, seen from where you sit?
So our group is focused on the human aspects of what's going on, which I don't think gets a lot of consideration, and it's sometimes hard for people to put that into perspective, what that might mean. And so I'm going to use the example of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which makes it very, very much a priority to include Indigenous voice going forward. And when those kinds of commitments about human impact and hearing human voice are reflected in commitments that countries are making to coming up with solutions to these problems, I think that's a really good indication of what we need to commit to. And recently in Canada, just actually last week, the federal government, the province of British Columbia, and British Columbia First Nations committed to a $1 billion partnership for Indigenous-led biodiversity work, and that is flowing out of that global biodiversity framework. So I think we're starting to see how the human aspects are being incorporated into initiatives going forward, and it'll be more and more important for us to get our heads around that. And that is something that Sebastian talked about in his presentation. It's really important work that's going on, maybe with Canada leading the way.
Fantastic. So here we have another suggestion for a good option from a human point of view. Mark?
Adding to the human technology deployment and technology policy development, I think that came out very nicely, that it's pretty much, the sort of same strategies, the sort of same long-run objectives, but very different policy lines. So comparing these policy lines, drawing conclusions on the good practices, but we also said, and that was interesting, learning from the bad practices, the things that you usually, as a policymaker, you try to hide. You don't speak about, failures, you tend to speak about how good, how glorious all is, but we know it isn't. And you can learn from failures. So getting an open debate, getting an open comparison on this energy side would be extremely, extremely helpful to draw lessons learned from that. That point number one, and that's certainly something for the policy level, something for the governance side to actually engage much more in this comparative debate. Bringing it down to this very amphitheater, the idea was also that it can't be only government level only. Certainly, as Charlotte mentioned, multi-level governance, so we have the other levels in, so that clearly is an aspect. And then also bringing in people. So Diana, looking to you now, we had the aspect and we had the argument, and Giacomo putting that very strongly, of saying there is no transformation without the people. So we have to get bottom up the people in. We can't just design grand strategies of, here's our blueprint for zero emissions 2050, hurrah, we've got it. And then it's a strategy which just, doesn't work with the people. That there's people also making a living from fossil fuels. So there's a whole transformational policy which need to be designed, and we need to get the people, on that road. So how do we integrate these people, and how do we actually manage to get a transformation in place, which is a transformation bottom up, from the people, for the people?
Okay. Milind, what's your option?
You want me to give you one option?
You can give us as many as you have.
Methane. Okay, let me start with that, right? Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. Depending on the time constant that you pick, it's 80 times as bad as CO2 or 30 times as bad as CO2, depends on the choices you make. Now, we are using so much natural gas, around the world, right? And one thing that we're starting to realize is the production as well as the transmission is very leaky. And until recently, it was very hard to figure out, where the leaks are. The methodologies were complex. But now we're getting to a point where, through remote sensing, you can actually pick out the specific place where there is a leak, right? Now so now you have the means to go after something that has been increasing. It's huge. It's short term. It involves firms that are wealthy, who can save money while they actually plug their leaks. The nation states that are involved in this are all mostly rich. They're responsible for this. They're the ones whose behaviors and whose consumption is creating externalities. Well, it seems to me that that's actually something that we all, including the ExxonMobils of the world, can get behind. Okay, so it's pretty staggering how the sort of remote sensing technology has shifted, and it's coming on board in the next year, where you can literally pinpoint to the location, to that part of the pipeline where there is a leak. Right? So to me, that's fantastic news. Now, is it going to solve the entire problem? Of course not. But is it going to actually go after something in a very concrete way that is potentially quite large in the short term? So that would be my sort of, economists create these cost effectiveness sort of emissions reduction supply curves. And the curves go from negative cost to reducing carbon all the way to positive. And this thing has got to be way down negative, first thing to go after. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm some, techno freak, given all the humanists around me. So let me actually sort of speak of a few other.
We're pushing you a little bit, of course, we know.
So one of the things, I do believe that there are lots of things to be done outside the rich countries, right? Partly because the co-benefits of doing them are huge. In the sense that, let's say you make a building in France more energy efficient and less leaky. The people might, feel a bit warmer, although the buildings in France seem to be quite warm. And maybe they save a bit of money. But if you imagine that same effort being put into, let's say, replacing a cook stove somewhere, it's a hard problem. I'm not saying the cook stove problem is easy, but if that effort goes into that question, then you're talking about helping order of 3 billion people and saving, potentially millions of lives, right? So I think one of the challenges that we have in answering the question of what is your objective? Is your objective just straight reducing CO2 emissions, or are you thinking about the sort of, the broader picture in the world and how you can combine CO2 reductions with other more humanist goals? So those are the sorts of things I think I would focus on.
Wow, this was very interesting because one can see that we've got multiple entry points for this conversation, whether it's at the policy, at the politics, at the institutional, at the human, at the technological, at the framing. And the choices on the framing would matter a lot. So, I think from this conversation it's pretty clear that I was going to ask you a second question, which is where do we start? But you've given me very good ideas for where we could start that would give us scale. So let me ask you, given this, and given that this initiative, CARE, is about mobilizing leadership at the level of the students, how can our cooperation create initiatives for students to engage in climate transitions? So how do we tie this back to them? And then I'll give you guys the floor to shoot your questions in this direction. Shall we start with you, Milind?
Sure. One of the challenges that I face, I've been teaching climate for, 20, 25 years as undergraduates, graduates. And it used to be that about a decade ago, I also framed climate change as some long-term, multi-decadal problem, right? All the kind of the IPCC reports and, looking at cost-benefit over time and getting the discount rate right and all those sorts of, analytical tools we use to do analysis of these kinds of problems. And then I didn't even, at some point, there was a tipping point where I didn't even start believing any of it, right? I was like, this doesn't make any sense because it's no longer a problem with a time constant of decades, it is now. And so I think that really, and also I could see it in the students because they were in the class to really learn about this problem and its solutions, and here I was, saying 2100 and, all these abstract numbers. And so the thing I realized is all of us, but particularly young people, need hope, right? And hope is not something that you can manufacture out of thin air. It has to be tangible. It has to be real, right? I can, speak about all the things that we can do and how wonderful they're going to be till my face turns blue, but unless that is convincing, right? Unless that is actually something the students buy, that I buy, we have not made any progress. So the thing that I think people should do is work on, so maybe sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish, but let me say it anyway. Work on solutions-focused problems at some really manageable scale. To really feel like their work and their commitment is actually making some tangible difference somewhere. Because even if you're not going to change the world based on that one project, it is what is giving you the hope and the capacity to sort of build on this experience to do something bigger and better, right? And so I'm sort of telling my students to go and do field work, even if the problem is relatively circumscribed. I met a student here from Munich, Christoph. Hello, Christoph. Who's going to India, to Bombay, and he's going to be working on building mini-grids. Yeah. Now, mini-grids are fabulous because what they do is you literally have to build the grid itself on bamboo poles, right? Put wires, you have solar panels, maybe you have batteries, you have ways to figure out how people can steal to stop theft, to come up with a business model and ways in which poor people can actually pay. It's a very rich technical problem, an economic problem, and a human problem that people can work on, and that's just one example of hundreds. So that's what I propose is this program tries to come up with such ideas where you can actually start to see your effort bearing fruit.
Wow, so this is great. We already have solutions in the making even before we've started the CARE program. I'm happy by that. Mark?
I think it's just, you tell me. It's about you students, but from my side, I think the idea would be to get everybody in the same room. Having joint seminars, Canadians, Europeans, and just get the two different perspectives together, because they can be, very similar, but then there's this sort of certain twist where suddenly it's turning different, and that is where the interest is. We've done some time ago, a nice seminar jointly with the European Commission looking into devising new energy efficiency policies. Just today we learned that actually, Canadian building policies, could take quite a bit from the European side. So learning that way, and the other way around from technology development in Canada for the European side, it would be fantastic to have students analyze that, but across that cross-cultural, dimension, with the two different sets of eyes on it, which probably would give very different results. So I think that'd clearly be, one aspect of taking it. Then looking at us, the panel, you in the room, we've all got different backgrounds and different ideas in terms of disciplines, taking it in, so working on the interdisciplinary side. We've spoken about local communities, bottom up, from the energy side, so getting you in, Diana, and taking this perspective in is just the interesting thing. looking at Charlotte's cities, here again, I mean, it's amazing how you can play smart and sustainable cities. I mean, the different levels of it. Is it energy? Is it just technology? Is it green? Is it working for the people? So there are so many aspects. Just banging all of that together is just fascinating, really. And I could go on, but actually it should be you telling us.
Thank you, Mark. Diana.
So I give this a lot of thought because my son is about your age, and I teach environmental impact assessment to fourth-year graduate students, and I see that the solutions that are coming from our generations aren't working, and I see the creativity in your generation and the fearlessness. And I think that you have to embrace that. I think that you don't understand your strength, that you need to empower yourself to use your voice, because we use the example of one of the students who spoke yesterday from Brazil. You were using the example of one of your communities where the largest population was the young people, and over 50% female. That is such a strength that you hold within your hands. I think about an example in Canada where government decided that communities in the north should come off diesel because of how polluting diesel fuel can be. But the situation was that it was becoming increasingly more expensive to ship diesel to communities in the north. And so government had this top-down policy, we're going to come off diesel, and then went to the communities to tell them that that's what was going to happen. And the community said, well, nobody asked us if we wanted to come off diesel, and it employs people in our community, and there were all kinds of reasons why they wanted to stay on diesel. So making space for community Indigenous voice is really important. And so I'm going to say that you really need to embrace the power that you have within yourself.
Thank you. That's very inspirational. Charlotte.
You know, I think it's a great question because in so many ways, students have not waited for us to start, putting programs and teaching programs and new programs together. And I think they very much had the lead in so many ways. They have those great initiatives. We had one yesterday in my panel, but there are others at Sciences Po, and I'm sure there are as part of the CARE partnership, that just to look out there, what are our students already doing? What are their initiatives, and how can we support them? As researchers, as academics, sometimes they need guidance, just to put some papers out there, to write some papers that can have more impact. It's also about connecting them with experts, and sometimes they don't really know, how to find faculty and where to find the experts also in their direct environment. So I think that's the first thing, to look at what initiatives are already there, to support the students that are already actively seeking, to develop some initiatives, to develop some solutions, to take leadership also on what future generations are going to do tomorrow, and when I say tomorrow, it's like January, starting your internship, going into your career and so on. So it's really now. So I think this is one way to start, and to support them with this, and to support them actively by bringing together and building the bridges between students, between research and policymakers. And this is something that we certainly want to try to do at Sciences Po in the different schools, but also in the Institute for Environmental Transformations, to support that. There maybe are two more things that I wanted to say here, is that we also need to guide students in the sense that, and this is perhaps the case and the trend that we have here at Sciences Po, because we are a social science university. Our students, they often think that because they're not engineers, or some of them, they were not all trained as engineers, and they were not all trained in the natural sciences. They think that because they are trained into institutional aspects, politics, human aspects, it's maybe a barrier, for them to be active in this. And this is something that we want to tell them is, you're going to matter in this sense. We cannot just leave this question of climate transition to natural sciences. We cannot just let it to engineering sciences. It doesn't mean that they don't matter, that they're not bringing in valuable discussions. It just means that we need to think about this interdisciplinary. And those that are trained into thinking about governing, into capacity building, into how to implement and reach those hard and difficult choices, they are going to be absolutely central to the thinking that we're going to have in the next few years and beyond. So that's the second point, to bring this together, to think more interdisciplinary, and maybe to bring a partnership that will allow to go a bit further even into the interdisciplinary work that each university, each care partner has starting to do, and to build great programs. And finally, I also want to think about, we had some questions yesterday in our panel about low-hanging fruits. And I think it depends a little bit on the context in which we are based, and I think it's important for all of us to be very, very practical about this. There are some contexts, thinking about Europe here, in which low-hanging fruit is absolutely critical because nothing is being done yet. And there are lots of places in Europe where nothing is happening. Nothing is happening. Lots of climate delaying because it's difficult, because it's politically unstable, because lots of questions. So low-hanging fruits might be the solutions, but there are some contexts in which we need to go beyond low-hanging fruits. We need to go beyond small-scale solutions. We need to scale up, to intensify, to accelerate, to speed up, just to build something that is going to matter at the national level, at society level, to transform a bit more deeply the way our society function, our politics function, our institutions function, our economy function, and this is one of the ways through which we can achieve, those hard changes. And I think we need to be very, very pragmatic about this. And having done research in very different contexts, I know that we need to make sure that the low-hanging fruits are being tested in those environments where this might be the only way to demonstrate that something is possible, and not to just have the impression that you're looking at a mountain which is so big that you can't climb it. But in some countries, we can't be lazy anymore. We need to really start going on the other side of the mountain. And I think there is enough capacity to do that. And we really depend on students and the younger generation to just take that seriously and to go beyond this climate delaying discourses, I would say. So these would be the 3 points.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Let me open the floor to you. So as usual, you've got mics on the right and on the left. You can go and have a go. Briefly say who you are and put your question.
Good evening. My name is Federica, and I'm a second-year student of the School of Public Affairs in the Master of Public Policy. And my question concerns an element that I think is very important whenever we talk about climate change and climate solutions, namely I'm talking about food. In particular, considering that food systems are responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and we all know what's going on with food insecurity. And the reason why I'm asking this is because I think it's deeply linked with other themes that we talked about, namely energy as well as water. And so I was wondering whether there is a role in the program and the initiatives we talked about and what that would be, and also considering that we talked about governance and actors at the national, regional, and local level. Thank you.
So, agriculture, food systems. Milin, do you want to go?
Waste, food waste, right? I mean, the first thing that I look at when I hit any problem is the efficiency, right? Because if you're doing something inefficiently, that's a problem. So you don't even have to, you might have to put some new systems in place. But food waste, especially I think my understanding is France is doing pretty well on the food waste picture. Or at least that's the view that I get from reading articles. But the food waste in North America, for example, is enormous. So again, I understand that low-hanging fruits might differ from place to place, but this is one low-hanging fruit, at least in certain places, that one could go after, because a lot of the other changes to the food system at the consumption level, trying to convince people not to eat beef and lamb, and changing practices, those are, I think, a slightly higher, a bigger bar to meet. So I would start at least with the waste problem.
Thank you, Federica. Over there.
Hello, are you saying?
I think it works.
Okay, perfect. My name is Vinicius, first-year student at Spo. My question is about financing, and why? Because we have spoken in many of the panels, and it's quite important to think of the possibilities and the potentials of our own contexts and lower-hanging fruits, and starting from the communities and the huge potential there is there, especially in a Global South perspective. But then we think of climate finance and the North and South inequalities. We think of the climate negotiations in terms of climate finance and pledges that weren't fulfilled. And so we come at a problem in which sometimes we either need to continue doing the things that we want to do and the things that we can, or should we still go forth in trying to build a financial archetype that will deal with sovereign debt and climate finance as well, and inclusion. How do you see this problem, and should we continue, is it possible to do both things at the same time?
Charlotte, do you want to go?
It's a hard one. Maybe other panelists, will want to answer that as well. Maybe you, actually, Aaron, also have a view on this, but maybe I'm stepping here. I think in terms of climate financing, I guess there are two different things to consider. What struck me as part of the research, I'm going to take my researcher hat back, but part of the research that I did in the past on how to think about the management of natural resources in different urban contexts, it was extremely striking. And in this research, we looked at different contexts around the world. So we had really different situations there. And what struck me quite a lot is that as part of the discussion on the green growth, on sustainable development goals, in a number of countries around the world, this had opened many opportunities for public and private actors to reorganize themselves. So basically for state interest to work together with a number of large firms to reorganize their interest in order to invest, for example, in water companies, infrastructure development, in energy, and so on. So financing was not an issue in the sense that in all those countries, and here I'm talking about the countries I looked at, it was Peru, it was Singapore, I was looking at South Africa, we also looked at Brazil, we looked at a number of countries around the world where it wasn't so much in terms of climate finance because the large project could be developed, they were very much co-designed, public-private partnerships, state interest working in close interactions with a small number of private firms. But the main problem is that most of them were really concentrated in a few areas in the countries, but not necessarily supporting some of the communities, some of the more rural areas, or maybe just some of the more remote places that were in those countries. So you had a high concentration of such finance in a little number of places and a few projects that were identified as priorities. And this is where we can link to your second question. So the second part of your question is about how to make this transition just. So it's not just about, leveraging the money and finding the money, and I think there is a lot of money at the moment going into climate transition, whether it's being about mitigation or adaptation, whether it's going into the right priorities is a different question, but it's really about how to make this transition a bit more just and to bring issues of inclusiveness, answering development issues, addressing issues of poverty, addressing issues of inequality, and this is where we need more effort to be done. And in this particular case, I do not have any questions, any answers, sorry, but I still think that there is quite a lot of work to do. I'm not very hopeful about the next COP, to be quite honest, but maybe it's the pessimist speaking here. From what we heard, for example, yesterday about the loss and damage mechanisms, I'm not too optimistic to look at the state of cooperation between a number of countries around the world, both within North, within South, and across, is not very good. So I think there are a number of issues to say, but maybe this is where I still have a doubt, and I wouldn't know how to answer this completely.
I mean, I would add to that we have lots of conversations on financing. We are even having a discussion about changing the international financial architecture and how it can be reformed in a manner that channels the financing that exists at the conditions that are necessary to the places most in need. But I fear there is a discussion, if I look at climate change, and I want to think in particular about adaptation, there is a discussion that we are also not having, that we should be having, which is more about how do we systematize a little bit more the efforts on adaptation? Because for a big part of the world, what matters is in the adaptation space. And it's not just a question of financing. It is a question of financing, but it's also a question of systems, matrix, just understanding who's doing what and where. And that space, in my view, has been overlooked in a conversation that focuses a lot on finance and not necessarily on this other systemic aspect of organizing the transformation on the adaptation side. The gentleman.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for speaking here. My name is Taseo. I am a first-year master's student of Human Rights and Humanitarian Action. And I actually have a question for the Canadian speakers, because we've talked a lot about cooperation internationally and also about sticks and carrots nationally. But I was thinking, as there's a legislation in the EU which just passed, or which just got out of it, began its transition phase, which is called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which basically forces companies outside of the EU to pay a tax when they come inside the EU, a CO2 tax for certain industries. And it was pretty much praised a lot here in the EU, but it's basically a stick from the EU to other countries. And I was wondering how it was received in your countries and how you think personally on such a measure to force like CO2 taxes from like the EU to the rest of the world.
I can't really answer that. So.
Yeah, I mean, Canada is a jurisdiction that actually prices carbon. Right? I mean, right now it's $65 a ton. It's going to Canadian dollars. It's going to escalate to $170 a ton. We hope, if there's, unless something happens politically. So, frankly, there hasn't been much of a ripple in Canada on the CBAM. At least I haven't seen that much debate. It seems to me that Canada might actually end up becoming a beneficiary of some of these actions. So it's a great idea. I mean.
So you would find it okay if like Canada would force other countries, or would you like this to be in place for the Canadian economy as well? Then would you think it's a good idea?
Well, I mean, Canada has a different problem, right? We have a neighbor down south, and so I don't think. I mean, the two economies are tied at the hip. So there's nothing that Canada can do analogous to what European Union is doing. But I think what European Union is doing is actually
because the US is very mad. Because of this.
Do you want to add, Mark, on that?
Yeah, maybe sort of defending the European Union. I used to work for the European Commission, so sorry for that. It's sort of flashbacks.
I also like the legislation, just so you know.
So I think probably the ripple down in Canada wasn't too shocking, because I mean the second part of this CBAM mechanism is, well, will not beat you if you have a similar system in place. So there, in a sense, it's also this sort of, I mean, policy cooperation, of forcing other constituencies into this policy cooperations. Now, should the EU be doing it? I mean, here again, different debate. I mean, would we like the US to do it to us? Here again. But just saying that, I mean, if we want to be serious about, I mean, addressing climate change, I mean, there has to be cooperation. If forcing is the way through, to be debated, but certainly, I mean, as an effective mechanism of sort of pushing for more action, apparently the thing proves to be effective, but debate to be continued.
Thank you for
Thank you. You hear a big noise as the projector that overheats and then makes this funny noise. So if you can't hear properly, just move to the front. There's nothing we can do, because then we will be switching off the Zoom. Over there. Sure.
Thanks, all of you, for the interesting panels, also yesterday. And I want to kind of connect my question to also yesterday's question, where in the multi-level governance context, we talked about low-hanging fruit. And today I want to ask like a harder question. So there's these really strong lock-in effects, right, of infrastructure, of all these industries, these carbon-heavy industries surrounded by that. Concrete streets. You have these big industries in Germany, so like this car-loving culture, sort of, where there's really hard and big problems. And I wanted to ask, like, how can we drive change in these fundamentally embedded industries where these are sort of also like almost impossible to think of that they can quickly change, but yet they make such a big proportion of the problem. So like, how can we really drive change in these areas and sort of tackle this lock-in, this very multifaceted lock-in effect?
Maybe, I mean, I don't have a definite answer for that, but I think there has been some great work that has been done by a team which has been dismantled since, but used to work at the Department of Environment at the OECD. That was led by someone called Aimé Aguirre-Rabilar. And they produced a very interesting report about system thinking and how to produce transformative change through systems thinking. And the case study that they were able to work on has been to work together with the government of Ireland to think about the road system and how to think about, how to apply this system thinking approach to reallocating road space in the Irish case. So of course you may want to argue, Ireland is not Germany in terms of its car manufacturing industry. It is not. It is maybe a smaller country also within the EU and so on. So there are lots of things that would say, all right, we can't. We can't expand that solution. But it's a very interesting way to bring together system thinking theory and the different ways through which we can very systematically identify all the lock-in aspects, but also to bring them together with some thinking about how to achieve transformational change within a given institutional system or within a given political system. And through this project, they were then able to raise some interest together with the Spanish government, together with some different countries in Africa, and now they're spreading, this work. And now that Aimé is not working with the OECD anymore, she's pursuing this work together with the Hot and Cool Institute in Berlin, where they're really trying to bring together this thinking to different sectors and to compare what could be achieved within that. So it's just one example, from the work that is currently being done. But beyond that, I think that looking at lock-in is quite interesting from two perspectives. First, it's important to be aware of where those locks are being postponed and how to think about dismantling them. Some of them are created by technical issues, some of them have to do with market, some of them have to do with public policies themselves, And this is something that we need to be aware. How is this lock-in process taking place? How do we build past dependency, and how do we bring some new innovation in there? And there are lots of things in the literature out there that helps us think about how to get beyond those locks. So I think, again, not a solution, but I think we have lots of tools, frameworks to help us think about to do it, and it's a little bit going towards what I was saying earlier on. We can't just afford to look at the low-hanging fruits anymore. We need to start looking at those locks and see how they can be, open, dismantle one after one, and it's also about dismantling some policies. It's about dismantling some clienteles that exist. It's about transforming our governance system. It's about, transforming economic models. This is about a transformative change that we need to look at.
Yeah, I just want to respond. I mean, I don't know how to unlock things, but I think we should stop the lock-ins from starting. Right? Two examples, both from the United States, both from the late 90s, mid-late 90s. There's something called the Clean Air Act Amendments of 1990, which put certain emissions controls on cars. Okay, it was a good thing because that meant you're going after the ozone problem and so on. But guess what? Those same amendments were not applied to trucks. Okay, what happens then is all the car manufacturers switch to something we now know as sports utility vehicles, and the SUVs are not subjected to these amendments. So all of a sudden now, you have continents locked in to giant cars that no one needs. Okay, so that's one example. So someone somewhere, I mean, this was almost predicted at the time when this happened, right? So those kinds of things should be stopped before they actually take place, because it's very hard to unravel something that then becomes so culturally rooted. The second thing is, another example is ethanol in gasoline. Right? Now, think about it. It's been At the time ethanol was proposed, it was considered to be a good thing because Brazil also was doing it, energy security, all those kinds of things, right? Well, now, of course, something like 10% of US gasoline is ethanol made from corn from 4 states in the Midwest. It's locked in. You know, the way the US Federation works, you're done. So as much as it would be great to unlock, it would be really incumbent upon analysts and policymakers and everyone else to be on the lookout for things that get locked in, not just technologically, but culturally and politically.
Thank you so much. We'll take the last two questions and we'll take them together. Please.
Yes, I'll try to keep it short. So one theme that I kind of saw across all the roundtables the past 2 days was very much just transition and making sure that we have a lot of bottom-up mechanisms to make sure that the citizens are on board with climate transitions and also feel the benefits locally. But I'm just wondering, how do we make this trade-off between justice and efficiency in this transition? And then kind of related to that, how, if we have local solutions and bottom-up governance, how do we ensure that then at the local level citizens do not kind of look across or beyond their own bubble and their individual and community interests and kind of see this larger picture while making local interested decisions? Like it's just a big issue for me.
Thank you. And the last question, please.
Hello. So I think whenever we hear conversations about climate transitions, we hear a lot about green growth and sustainable growth, and the focus a lot of the times is still on growth. And there's critiques of this that says an obsession with growth is inherently unsustainable. And I'm just curious what I don't know, some or all of you think about the idea of degrowth and how degrowth is necessary for us to actually reach any kind of goals.
Thank you. So, Diana, on the...
So, while I'm hearing those questions being asked about the just transition and bottom-up solutions, I think about what I represent, and I represent a systemic, institutionalized, top-down, imposed order on a population. And without changing that structure, we can't change colonialism. So how can we change the way people think about sustainability and energy and climate change without systemic structural change? And I think about what we've done in Canada is Natural Resources Canada releases a yearly report on climate change, and they post the wonderful achievements they've made year after year after year. And there was always lacking an Indigenous voice in those national climate assessments. So we, in the last 2 years, have co-authored, Indigenous people have co-authored a companion document to the National Climate Assessment that tries to come up with bottom-up solutions, with challenging the notions of unsustainable growth, and we'll see what reaction we get to that companion report. I suspect, like other things that Indigenous people do, there's going to be a lot of pushback. But we try to flag where we can that some of these assumptions that are being made by the dominant structures are the wrong assumptions to start with. So that's what I would say about ensuring that more bottom-up local solutions are embedded in policy and institutional structures.
Mark?
Degrowth, yes. Asking the economists about degrowth. It's going to be a long night tonight. But no, I mean, the sort of, quick answer to that is that the present concepts that we're seeing, be it European Green Deal or be it the Canadian Green Transformation, is pretty much centered around growth, with the argument that growth will bring us, the additional financial means to also finance the transformation, to smoothen out the transformation. So the just transition argument, finding the money to actually pay for that. So that is the strategy which you have at present. The idea, though, would be not only growth, but a different growth. So not more, but qualitatively different, growing in environmental technologies, so that actually that thing turns into a sort of, positive spiral of getting better. Is that the answer? Not sure. The interesting thing is that pretty much, from an environmental economist perspective, the interesting thing is that when we start the debate, we're starting a debate which was actually kicked off in the 1970s, so 70s of the last century. And we're still leading it, but finally leading it. So I think, this sort of qualitative growth, or green growth, as you would probably label it now, is probably a starting point, but certainly not the end of the debate. And the interesting thing for now, 2023, so 50 years after the thing actually sort of was pushed in the debate, we're finally at the point in time where we have the scientific means to debate it, and the interest to debate it. So we just launched and will have actually a conference on sufficiency. For ages and years, just mentioning the word sufficiency, sort of reduce yourself to what is needed and not, there's always more. Couldn't have done it, frankly speaking, because you would directly be washed off stage. So no real answer to that, but finally the momentum is there to have the discussion, but not an easy one.
Yeah, and I would say to end this conversation that this conversation about sufficiency may be better than degrowth, because degrowth may be very appealing in this room, but there is one part of the world where they would like to just be part of a growth strategy they've not been to. So bringing these people into this kind of conversations would also probably be helpful. Hence, maybe sufficiency is a more appetizing way to discuss this. So let me thank you for what I thought was a very good way to wrap up a day and a half of conversations. I've taken the challenge that Madhur put to us. So with a few words that have come up in this conversation: solutions, low-hanging fruits, policy options, bringing voices, human sciences, governance, action, transformation, I've come up with a little poem that would be slow probing for huge impact. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day and look forward to seeing you again soon.